We're in another workshop session covering the rate study process. And before we start, if you could go back, Andrea, I want to remind everybody that we have a business that serves 25,000 customers every month, and we do it face-to-face whenever possible or necessary or desired by our customers. And that's a pretty big business. And behind the scenes, that calls for a pretty significant investment in infrastructure to control a product that's basically deadly, but we make it safe and usable for our customers. So last month we talked about some cost of service principles, and this month we want to talk about some rate design concepts. Next slide. Just to recap, last month we talked about cost of service and basically revenue requirements, which are, what are the costs that need to be paid by the utility, and how do we allocate those costs to the different customer classes. And once we have that, we allocate the cost based on usage, which is similar to what customers get billed on. So rate design is simply revenue requirements divided by the billing units. We talked last month about two kinds of, yes, that's right, go ahead. Two kinds of rate design, two basic rate designs, and they kind of mirror the different kinds of costs. We have customer related costs, energy related costs, and demand related costs. The three-part rate basically recovers those three different kinds of costs from three different kinds of charges to the customer. And we did mention that the two-part rate, while it's simpler, it does sacrifice some of that cost allocation detail by taking the demand related cost and lumping them in to the recovery from the energy charge. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. In the rate design issues that we talk about today, I want to kind of illustrate the sort of competing objectives of rate design. And we have issues of risk assignment, that kind of what trade-off between the customer and the utility in terms of who is going to be facing the impacts of the uncertainty in what the costs are actually turn out to be. That's one issue. Another issue is, are we allocating cost to the customer classes based on the cost causation? In other words, we want to try to get the revenues to line with the costs that are being incurred, and assign those revenues to the customers that are causing the costs. And all of that is based on what data is available, and different rate designs have different data requirements, and different cost allocation methodologies require different kinds of data. But first I want to just circle back a little bit to the prior workshop, and one of the big questions that came out of that was, how do we know if the revenue requirements are reasonable? And that's a big question. It's a good question, and it's one of the most important questions that you, the board, has to answer. And so I want to make sure that we're clear on how you go about getting comfortable with the revenue requirements and therefore the rates that are being proposed. And so in order to develop what we believe the revenue requirements need to be, in other words, what level of rates need to be in the future, we look at what we expect the cost to be. And we do that based on what historically the costs have been and how we expect them to change in the future. We have other financial requirements associated with bonds, debt service coverage. We look at the rating agencies' evaluation factors. They have different metrics for financial strength. And the more financial strength we can demonstrate, the better the bond rating we get, the better the bond rating, the lower the cost of debt. And debt is a huge cost for the utility. But we also want to be comparable and competitive with other utilities. And obviously these are competing goals. So, and that's all laid out in our strategic plan. It's recognized in that PPS will have to balance the long-term financial stability with fair rates. So this is actually from the strategic plan that I think all of you were on the board when the strategic plan was developed. These are the objectives that have come out of that planning process. And again, these are competing objectives because, the long-term financial stability, you need money in order to achieve those goals, but the more money you need, the higher the rates are. So you don't want to, sacrifice low rates in order to achieve high financial stability, but you also don't want to sacrifice financial stability for just to achieve low rates. So there's a balance there. When we talk about bond ratings, you can go to the next one. Here's an example illustration for how the Moody's looks at our financial strength. These are different metrics for how they come up with our bond rating. And some of these, like the black 15 you see, that is power procurement. That's because we have a pretty significant chunk of coal capacity, and that's not necessarily something we can move easily. We think about it all the time, but and are constantly doing everything we can to lower the cost associated with that. But it's not something that we're going to be able to address in the rate study. The other green ones, though, are measures that may be impacted by the rate study. So anyway, you do this math here and you come up with an 8.1. Go to the next slide, you can see that 8.1 is firmly in the range of Baa1, which is the current rating from Moody's for PPS. But like I said, if we could move 3 out of 4 of those green factors, we could possibly get in the range of A3. That's not going to be easy. It may not even be mathematically possible, but I think we can look at it and consider it and just make a conscious decision that that's a goal we're either not going to strive for, or we're going to make the sacrifices necessary to achieve that. So that's kind of the look at how you kind of determine whether the revenue requirements are reasonable. We kind of look at all of those things and take that into consideration. Then we start to get into rate design and some of these issues that I wanted to cover today. Risk assignment and financing. There are different cost recovery mechanisms, and they can be evaluated in terms of efficiency of cost recovery. In other words, as you incur a cost, you are able to bill a like amount of revenues to cover those costs. There's the issue of complexity. How complicated is it for the customer to understand, and risk responsibility. And then, again, this risk I'm talking about is the variability of costs, the uncertainty of costs, who will be bearing that variability. And the next issue, data requirements and availability, is we have a lot of data required to determine the revenue requirements, but that's data that's readily available. That's our financial data primarily, other forecast data. Then when we get the revenue requirements, we need to allocate those costs to the customer classes. And part of that allocation is through data like customer usage and billing data, which we have readily available for historical data. And then system load and interval usage data. And now interval usage data, we're going to talk about a little bit more, because that intervals are like how much is being used in this hour. So we have a advanced metering infrastructure that measures hourly usage for all customers, and that's a big advancement in technology and data availability, and we want to take advantage of that. And the third issue is, Third issue is causation and allocation, and again here we want to try to make sure that that we allocate the costs to the customer classes in proportion to how those customers contribute to the costs. And so we'll be talking about this CP and NCP and how that relates to billing demands, for example. Okay, now look at the efficiency of cost recovery mechanisms, and I put some examples of different kinds of charges on a scale of complexity and risk responsibility. And at the bottom left is the fixed monthly charges, and this is a very simple rate design. This would be like monthly rent. Landlord charges a fixed amount every month. The customer knows exactly how much it's going to be every month. And it's simple. But for the landlord, and in this case the utility is the landlord, the responsibility for any variability in costs are borne by the landlord. So yes, he knows how much he's going to get every month in rent, but he doesn't know how much he's going to pay every month in costs. So it's not a very efficient cost recovery mechanism. The next one is energy only. This is sort of a pay-as-you-go. It's again maybe a little bit more complex, but it's a little bit more efficient, because now you're collecting the right amount of money, or you're collecting money more in proportion to usage. We talked about two-part rates. That's where you have a customer charge that recovers a certain component of cost, and you have an energy charge that recovers the energy usage costs, but that energy charge also recovers fixed costs. And so the utility is still bearing some risk that they don't know if those energy consumption charges are going to be adequate to pay the fixed capacity costs. And then an improvement on that, of course, is the three-part rate we talked about, but this becomes a little more complex, a little more transfer of the variability to the customer. Now they have two components of the rate that are going to vary based on their usage. And then beyond that, which we don't have time of use rates yet, but I think we should look at them as part of this. Time of use says that there are peak periods when costs are higher than at other times, and if we adjust our rates to have higher charges during the time when our costs are higher, then we not only assign the cost recovery responsibility more efficiently, but we also send an incentive to customers to use less when the costs are higher, so that we can pass on lower costs to them. And then finally, on the example of real-time pricing is we do have costs that we actually pay based on real time. It's mostly on an hourly basis, scheduled. We only know about it the day before, what the price is going to be each hour the following day. And I'm not proposing that we do any kind of real-time pricing in our rates, but I wanted to put it out there as an example. And the illustration is like gasoline at the gas station. You don't know what the price is going to be tomorrow. The next time you fill up, it's going to be something different than the last time you filled up, and so that's a high uncertainty, but it's a high transfer of that uncertainty to the customer. And the gas station, if they're the one actually buying the gas and selling it, they don't really have to accept very much risk in that case. So what do we have next? Data requirements and availability. Again, the revenue requirements, we have good data on that. We could drill down a little bit and look at those power costs that do vary by hour. If we were to use that kind of information to help design a time of use rate. The main challenge in the rate study is to take these fixed or capacity or demand related costs and allocate them to customer classes. So we need a lot of hourly data, demand data by class and for the system. And so now we're getting really into some detailed data type stuff. And so we got to have a graph, right? So here's some graphs of load on the total system, Paducah Power System, and they are demands in megawatts. MW is megawatts for 24 hours of the day, the hour ending 1 a.m. through midnight. The red line is the demand on August 20th, 2019 for each hour of that day. And you can see that starts out low and then it gets really high in the middle of the day around hour 15 or 3 p.m. That's when every air conditioner in town is running full blast. And that's what a typical summer peak load shape looks like. The blue one is from February 14, 2020, and that's a winter peak day. And you can see it starts out low and it comes up to a peak around 10 a.m. and then it drops off a little bit and then it comes up a little bit more hour 20, 8 p.m. and then it stays kind of low. Now, coming from Florida, when we have winter peak load, not yet, winter peak load shapes, they are a lot, this is kind of a dual peak. There's a morning peak and an evening peak. And in Florida, they're they're a lot more peaky. There's a big peak in the morning and a big peak in the evening, and it's because in Florida you don't have very much gas heat. So all of the, on a cold day in winter, all of that heating load is electric load, and obviously up here a big portion of that is being served by gas. Finally, the green line is the that summer peak day reduced by the amount of output from our gas peaking plant here. So while it's a little misleading because currently we have a contract that much of that output goes to KYMEA through a power purchase agreement, but it does illustrate the magnitude of the size, the relative size of that peaking plant relative to our load. Okay, so now we want to talk about some more complicated stuff. And I've got the same summer peak curve, but I added a couple of more curves to represent examples of illustrative rate class A and rate class B. Now, we saw that the summer peak demand was obviously bigger than the winter peak demand. It occurred on that day in August, and at that hour of 3 p.m. So that's what we would call the system peak. And at that hour, the demands from rate class A and rate class B are shown there, and the CP is the coincident peak. So the coincident peak is what every class contributed to the system peak at that hour. So there's a coincident peak demand allocation factor that will be used to allocate certain costs that are shared by the whole system. And so if we have, for example, generation costs are what we design the system to serve this annual system peak, well, we want to allocate those costs based on what every customer class contributed to the responsibility to put that amount of capacity available for the system. Now, the other thing illustrated here is for each of those rate classes, they have their own peak. And that may not be at the same time as the system peak. So those are non-coincident peaks. They're not coincident with the time of the system peak. And so non-coincident peak is also used to allocate certain costs that are not necessarily shared completely by the whole system. So they're more closer to the customer load. So there's competing objectives here. If we look at coincident peak demand, for example, and say, what is it good for? From the point of view of the engineer, the coincident peak demand sort of illustrates what it costs us to serve that total system demand. And so we want to allocate those costs to those customers that cause the system demand in proportion to how much they contribute to that cost. So it's a pretty good representative data point for cost causation and allocation. From the analyst point of view, coincident peak demand, the issue is data availability. Do we have that sort of data? And you know, it does require interval data, and that comes from advanced metering. AMI system, and so we do have that data. So it's a pretty fair value for data availability. But from the customer's perspective, we're not going to ever bill customers based on coincident peak demand. It's too complex. There's too much uncertainty. We don't even know the coincident peak demand till well after the fact. So we can't really do that, especially on a retail level with a lot of customers. So that's kind of illustrates that there's a challenge of balancing what you want to do and what you're really able to do, and what would be the right thing to do for the customer. That sort of wraps up the discussion of those issues related to rate design. And next month, we'll get into more specifics about how we can use different sorts of rate design to create specific incentives for our customers. So there we are. Any questions? Artie, you got to turn your microphone.
There we go. How difficult is this? I've seen a lot of utilities in other places have this, where it's not based on the demand in different times of day. How difficult is that to get the issue over to the public?
Are you talking about time of use rates?
Yes.
It's actually become pretty well accepted practice to have time of use rates. You know, there's certain, you have to define the period, the on-peak period and the off-peak period, and accumulate the billing units in those periods and develop rates that recover the costs at different rates for those periods. But I think people are pretty accepting of it in terms of, you know, peak pricing is something that you face in throughout commerce. You know, you go to the golf course, there's on-peak rates and off-peak rates, and so I think it makes sense to people, and it's been used quite a lot of places.
Well, I've noticed a lot of appliances. I know I've got a dryer at home, but you can set the time for it to come on. So perfect time for me to put clothes in there and have it dry at 1 o'clock in the morning or something, right?
Right. Heat, you know, pool pumps and things like that. And another big thing to think about coming down the road is electric vehicles. You know, if we can encourage electric vehicles on the system and to have them charge overnight at a, you know, because the customer is getting the advantage of a really low overnight rate, that's good load for the system. That's a good way to help lower our costs.
Thank you very much, Doug. Anybody else got anything?
Doug, I had a question. On the non-coincidental peak, what types of cost would you use NCP for allocation? Like distribution, transformer sizing, things like that, or?
Yes, yeah, that's non-coincident peak is, these are costs that are based on peak demands at the customer, closer to the customer's level. And so you have to size transformers out on the distribution system based on the load within that area. So there's going to be, you know, residential areas are going to have residential size transformers that serve them, and they're going to peak at a certain time. And then downtown you'll have commercial, and out in the industrial park you'll have industrial, and so you'll have different size transformers, services that are located in different areas and have different costs. And the better we can do to isolate those costs and allocate them based on non-coincident peak, that'd be better.
Doug, what's a Class A and a Class B customer?
Those are just made up lines. I didn't
Okay.
have any real data. I just actually played with a combination of the winter and peak demand just to have them look different from each other.
Okay. The other question I had was on our bond rating. You know, you and Dave and I have talked, we've got another issue that we're going to be able to refinance in about 5 years of about $150 million. Our total bonds out there at about $450 million.
I don't have that number.
Well, my point was going to be this one we refinance in a few years is going to be a pretty big chunk of what we owe. So having a better rating in 5 years when those get issued, I'd be curious to see some comparison of triple B rates or triple B plus, which is where we are now, and A rates, which is where we want to be in our strategic plan, and what that might cost us over the life of the bonds when we refinance, to kind of give us an idea of that trade-off between fiscal responsibility and fair rates.
Absolutely.
And, you know, right now that spread may not be that large.
Right.
Interest rates as low as they are.
Right.
5 years from now, don't know, but we could put together like a little sensitivity analysis. If rates did this over this 5-year period, this is what the dollar amount we'd be talking about.
Good idea, Ed.
Yeah, I agree with you. The spread's probably not a whole lot right now.
Anybody else? Adavas? Mark Workman? Sandra? I'll entertain a motion to close shop.
Hardy, I just got
Yeah.
mine. I have one question. Are
Sure.
we still having 3 bond rating agencies, or didn't we go or eliminate someone?
We're down to one.
Down to
Moody's.
1. Okay.
One that we paid for.
But they will all rate even though we don't pay them?
Fitch still rates us even though we don't pay them.
Okay.
S&P, we had them withdraw the rating, which is a little different. So we don't pay them, and then they will not rate us.
Okay. So just one. Okay. Okay. That was my question, to clarify.
I guess we'll close the shop if nobody else has got any more.
I'll second the.
Any more? Okay. Thank you very much. See you next month.
Mhm.